Brandon Lee had everything ahead of him: fame, love, and a film that would make him a legend. But in a single night, it all ended with one gunshot that should never have happened. What the cameras captured was supposed to be fiction. Instead, it became one of Hollywood's darkest real-life tragedies. And for decades, no one could agree on what, or who, was truly to blame. The day everything went wrong. March 30th, 1993. The Crow was nearing its end. Only a handful of scenes remained before wrapping on April 8th. Brandon was exhausted, but proud. He had transformed James O'Barr's cult comic into a hauntingly poetic performance, a man who returns from the dead to avenge the murder of his fiancée. The role felt like destiny. And tragically, that night, it would echo reality in the most literal way. The scene was simple. Eric Draven, the character Brandon played, walks into an apartment carrying groceries. A gang member shoots him. He falls. Cut. Routine. There were no stunts, no pyrotechnics, nothing that should have been dangerous. Actor Michael Massey, who played the gunman Fun Boy, raised his revolver and pulled the trigger. The sound rang out like any other take. Brandon fell perfectly, as rehearsed. The director called cut. The crew clapped. For a moment, everything seemed fine, until someone noticed Brandon wasn't getting up. At first, they thought he was joking, staying in character. But when they saw the blood soaking through his shirt, panic exploded. Paramedics were called immediately. Brandon was rushed to New Hanover Regional Medical Center, where surgeons worked for hours. He received over 60 pints of blood, enough for 5 men. But the internal bleeding was unstoppable. At 1:03 p.m. on March 31st, 1993, Brandon Lee was pronounced dead. He was 28 years old. The news shattered Hollywood. "It didn't really look like anything was wrong," one crew member said later. "The grocery bags exploded, he hit the floor, and we thought it was just another take." But the autopsy revealed something impossible. A .44 caliber lead slug had torn through his abdomen, something no blank cartridge could produce. Somehow, a real bullet had been fired from a movie prop. The investigation and the curse of the Crow. In the hours that followed Brandon's death, confusion turned to disbelief. How could a real bullet find its way onto a professional film set? The weapon, a .44 caliber Smith & Wesson revolver, was supposed to be loaded only with blanks, cartridges that contain gunpowder but no projectile. But when investigators examined the gun, they found a bullet lodged deep inside the barrel, the kind that could kill a man instantly. At first, producers and crew scrambled to explain. Maybe it was a misfire, maybe debris had been stuck inside the barrel from a previous scene, but the autopsy confirmed something more specific. A real .44 slug had entered Brandon's body and lodged near his spine. The round was fired with full force. There was no mistaking it. This wasn't a malfunction of a blank. It was the catastrophic result of carelessness. The investigation revealed how that fatal chain of events began weeks earlier. During a close-up scene, the crew had used dummy rounds, bullets meant to look real for the camera, but without gunpowder. The team removed the powder but forgot to take out the small explosive cap, known as the primer. When one of these dummy cartridges was dry-fired for a camera test, the primer discharged just enough force to push the bullet tip into the barrel. No one checked the gun afterward. The projectile remained stuck there, a silent killer waiting for the next charge. Days later, the same revolver was reloaded for the grocery store scene, this time with blanks to create the sound and flash of real gunfire. The combination was deadly, a blank cartridge behind a lodged bullet. When Michael Massey pulled the trigger, the blank ignited the powder, built pressure, and launched the stuck bullet straight into Brandon Lee's abdomen. It was a tragic domino effect of oversight, exhaustion, and misplaced trust. And to make it worse, there was no licensed armorer on set that night. The responsibility for handling weapons had fallen to an overworked prop assistant, not a trained firearms expert. Nobody checked the gun before filming. Nobody held it up to the light to confirm the barrel was clear. Nobody paused to double-check the simplest rule of movie gun safety: treat every weapon as if it's loaded. The official ruling came soon after. Accidental death due to negligence. No criminal charges, no arrests. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration fined the production $84,000 for safety violations, later reduced to $55,000. A number that felt insultingly small for a lost life. But outside the legal paperwork, whispers began to grow louder. Crew members started talking about the strange tension that had haunted the Crow set from day one. Within weeks, journalists were calling it the curse of the Crow. Just months before Brandon's death, an electrician had been electrocuted and severely burned after touching a live wire. Another crew member was impaled by a falling screwdriver. A storm destroyed a major portion of the outdoor set, delaying filming for weeks. Some dismissed it as bad luck. Others said the production was doomed from the start. One anonymous crew member told Inside Edition, "People have tried to say it was haunted. I don't know about that. But there were definitely bad vibes on that set." Even producer Jeff Most later admitted that nothing ever seemed to go right. The more the crew pushed to meet deadlines, the more dangerous things became. After Brandon's death, filming stopped indefinitely. The studio considered canceling the entire project. Some executives feared the film would be too morbid to release, a macabre reminder of what had happened. But Brandon's fiancée, Eliza Hutton, and his mother, Linda Lee Cadwell, urged the studio to finish the film, not as a product, but as a tribute. Still, the shadow over the Crow was impossible to shake. It wasn't just the tragedy, it was the unsettling sense that the movie's story had somehow predicted its own ending. A man murdered, rising from the grave to avenge his death. The parallels were too close, too haunting. By the time filming resumed, many who had worked with Brandon said the set felt hollow, like the life had been drained out of it. Yet everyone knew they had to finish, not just for the studio, but for him. Negligence, cover-ups, and the truth about the gun. In the weeks following Brandon Lee's death, the official explanation seemed too clean, too convenient. The studio's statement called it a tragic accident caused by a malfunctioning prop. But when the full autopsy report became public, the details didn't quite fit the story everyone had been told. According to the report, the bullet recovered from Brandon's body was a fully intact .44 caliber lead slug, not a damaged fragment, not a deformed remnant of a dummy cartridge. It looked factory-made, clean, and real. That discovery raised an uncomfortable question. If no live rounds were ever supposed to be on set, then how did one end up inside the gun? Investigators eventually concluded that the dummy bullet had been lodged in the barrel, turning the blank behind it into a live shot. But several firearms experts quietly challenged that conclusion. They pointed out that a squib load, what happens when a bullet gets stuck in the barrel, usually leaves clear signs: a jammed cylinder, visible residue, or deformity on the bullet. None of that appeared in the evidence. The round extracted from Brandon's body was undamaged. To some, it looked like a real, complete bullet. Something that shouldn't have existed on that set at all. Even more troubling were the missing records. Investigators couldn't find documentation of who exactly handled the gun before the fatal scene. The prop inventory logs were incomplete, and no one could confirm who loaded the revolver that night. It was an astonishing oversight for a film involving firearms. When questioned, the assistant director admitted he hadn't personally inspected the weapon before calling action. He simply assumed it was safe. The chain of responsibility had collapsed completely. There was no licensed armorer present, an unforgivable breach of industry protocol. Instead, a young, exhausted prop assistant had been tasked with managing all weaponry, a job far beyond their experience. They'd been working 18-hour days, 6 days a week. Corners were cut everywhere, sometimes to save time, sometimes to save money. And this time, the cost was a man's life. To the outside world, it was easy to believe this was just a one-in-a-million tragedy. But within the crew, there was talk of something darker. Whispers of missing evidence, inconsistencies in police reports, and unanswered questions about how the live ammunition got there in the first place. Some believed it was deliberate sabotage. Others thought it was simply Hollywood's arrogance catching up with itself, a system so sure of its illusions that it forgot where the danger really was. Years later, even Detective J.J. Leitner, who led the investigation, admitted that something about the case still didn't sit right. "Nothing's been ruled out," he said in an interview. "We could never pinpoint exactly how that bullet got there. I have a gut feeling there's more to it." Meanwhile, the studio moved fast to protect itself. Lawyers surrounded the production, and any talk of foul play was quietly silenced. Brandon's mother, Linda Lee Cadwell, filed a civil lawsuit against the filmmakers and reached an undisclosed settlement, but no criminal charges were ever filed. For her, justice never came, only paperwork. To many fans, it felt like history was repeating itself. 20 years earlier, Bruce Lee's sudden death had also been ruled accidental. Death by misadventure. No one ever fully explained why a healthy 32-year-old man collapsed in a friend's apartment from cerebral edema. And now his son, at nearly the same age, was gone under equally mysterious circumstances. It seemed too cruel to be coincidence. 2 generations of the same family, both killed by inexplicable circumstances connected to film, and both surrounded by rumors of cover-ups, secrecy, and things the public was never meant to know. But if the world thought the mystery of Brandon Lee's death ended with the coroner's report, they were wrong. Because the deeper investigators looked, the more disturbing the picture became, not just about one accident, but about an entire industry built on illusion and denial. A legacy of shadows, the parallels between Brandon and Bruce. When Brandon Lee died, the world immediately thought of his father. 20 years earlier, in 1973, Bruce Lee had also died suddenly at just 32. The cause was ruled as brain swelling, but rumors of poison, revenge, and the triads soon followed. Brandon was only 8 then, a boy who grew up in the long shadow of a legend. In interviews, he spoke of his father with love, not worship. "If I had a child," he once said, "I'd want whatever I accomplished to be a benefit to him." Those words would echo tragically years later. Both men were young, fearless, and on the edge of superstardom. Both broke barriers in Hollywood, and both were taken in ways that seemed scripted by fate. In Game of Death, Bruce's character is shot on set by a real bullet. 2 decades later, the same nightmare became reality for his son during The Crow. Conspiracy theories called it the Lee family curse, but Brandon's sister Shannon Lee rejected that idea. "He was a real person, not a myth," she said. "The tragedy is enough. We don't need ghosts." The cruelest irony was that The Crow itself told a story of resurrection, a man rising from death to seek justice. Brandon was meant to play that hero. Instead, he became one. The film was completed after his death and released in 1994, dedicated to him and his fiancée. Today, Bruce and Brandon Lee rest side by side in Seattle, father and son forever linked by brilliance, destiny, and loss. The Long Shadow, the Rust shooting, and the lessons Hollywood forgot. Nearly 30 years after Brandon Lee's death, Hollywood repeated its worst mistake. In October 2021, actor Alec Baldwin fired a Colt .45 revolver on the New Mexico set of Rust, killing cinematographer Helena Hutchins. Like Brandon, Hutchins was struck by a live round that was never supposed to exist on set. And once again, the world asked the same haunting question: how could this happen again? For producer Jeff Most, the man who had watched Brandon wave goodbye that night in 1993, the news was unbearable. He knew Helena personally. "It was like losing Brandon all over again," he said. "We were supposed to have learned from it." But nothing had changed. The same shortcuts, the same exhaustion, the same blind trust that someone somewhere had checked the weapon. Following The Crow, studios promised reforms, mandatory safety inspections, licensed armorers, strict weapon handling protocols. But over time, vigilance faded, budgets tightened, corners were cut. By the time Rust began filming, those old habits had returned. After the tragedy, Baldwin and the film's armorer, Hannah Gutierrez Reed, were charged with involuntary manslaughter. Legal experts called the case unusual and hard to prove, but it exposed a brutal truth. The film industry still hadn't learned how to keep its people safe. Brandon's sister, Shannon Lee, summed it up best. "No one should ever be killed by a gun on a movie set." Period. The final revelation. For decades, people searched for a hidden conspiracy behind Brandon Lee's death, a curse, an assassin, a grand cover-up. But in the end, the truth was both simpler and more tragic. What killed Brandon wasn't a dark force. It was neglect. It was exhaustion. It was a system that treated safety as optional. The investigation's final report confirmed that there was no sabotage, no murder plot, no supernatural curse. What there was failure. A failure to check a barrel. A failure to separate real and fake ammunition. A failure to respect how fragile one life can be. When all the myths were stripped away, the answer that remained was the hardest to accept. Brandon Lee died because people stopped paying attention. Because the illusion of control in Hollywood had replaced real responsibility. Still, his death wasn't in vain. The tragedy forced the industry to change, at least for a time. It became the defining example of why safety matters more than the shot, the budget, or the deadline. Even today, producers and armorers cite The Crow when training new crews. And yet, as Rust proved, those lessons can fade with time. Brandon never got to see The Crow completed, but the film he gave his life to became immortal. It was released on May 13, 1994, dedicated to him and his fiancée, Eliza Hutton. In the movie, his character says, "It can't rain all the time." For millions who loved him, that line became a promise, that his light and his father's before him would never truly go out. 3 decades later, the mystery of Brandon Lee isn't about how he died. It's about why it happened at all. So now, the question is yours. Do you believe Hollywood has really learned from his death? Tell us your thoughts below. And if you want more untold stories from behind the screen, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay with us for the next one.